Good afternoon. Good to see everyone. Welcome to all of our visitors. We're glad you're here with us today. Today is the third anniversary of 9/11. It's the shorthand term we use for that terrible day when jihadists killed 3,000 or so American people and themselves in the process. As Christian people, we have a hard time understanding things like this. There's just too many unanswered questions. And we hold too many unfounded assumptions about God and about man. At our best, at our clearest thinking, we still are influenced by assumptions that we have never examined, never have thought much about, and consequently, we are oftentimes led to wrong conclusions. We're going to challenge some of those assumptions today. But to do so, we've got to take a look first at some history. There was a man named Isaac, son of Abraham. His wife's name was Rebekah. Rebekah had two sons. They were twins. Their names were Jacob and Esau. The Apostle Paul, in the 9th chapter of Romans, speaks of these two boys in terms that have troubled people down through the generations. It's in Romans 9, verse 10. Paul says, not only this, but when Rebekah had also conceived by one, even our father Isaac, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calls, it was said to her, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Now, I would not be the least bit surprised if that scripture troubles you. You will not be the first. It has troubled many people down through time who try to get their mind around what that means, what it could possibly mean, that before they are born, having done neither good nor evil, that the purpose of the election of God might stand, he said, the elder shall serve the younger. Now, it was not written at the time of Jacob and Esau. It was written much later in Malachi that God said, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. It's not easy to explain this passage of Scripture, at least not in any way that will make us comfortable, because it seems to imply, without any merit or demerit, God hated this little kid and decided that he would reject him from the day of his birth. How can that possibly be? Now, I'm going to suggest that we would be better served to remain uncomfortable and try to understand what's going on here than to apologize for God. In the course of the development of a human fetus, there is an infinite array of variables. One result of this is that no two of us have the same fingerprint. Another result of it is that no two of us have identical irises, so that consequently we can stare into a little hole and a device can look at our iris and identify us by the pattern of our iris, which is not like any other human being on the face of the planet. I understand it's even more reliable than fingerprints. Every single one of us, these variables from the same genetic material, develop two entirely, or in the case of twins, they can be very close, but they are still not absolutely identical. That all the way down through here, with the same DNA, we can develop very, very different people based upon, who knows, what kind of variables impact the development of the human fetus. Now, a question arises out of this that I have never asked before. Is there also, in the development of the human being, a moral variable? Is it possible that in the course of our development, in the womb, that certain aspects of what are ultimately going to be our moral character and moral structure take place, develop in the womb before we are even born? A variable that could, even before we were born, predispose, not predetermine, but predispose some people to antisocial behavior. Now, we have reasons to think so when we observe criminal behavior. I mean, there seem to be very strong indications that some people are born to be criminals. The psalmist certainly thought so. And this was one of the things when I was recording the Psalms that hit me like a ton of bricks when I came across it one day in preparing to read the Psalms on the tape. It's the 58th Psalm, one verse, verse 3. Psalm 58, verse 3. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. Now here is something spoken under the inspiration of God. And I presume it's something that the psalmist saw in the character of people, in the character of children, as they began to grow up toward adulthood, that could not be explained any other way. Now I would assume that if a fingerprint expert can determine identity by the loops and swirls on our fingertips, and apparently we have these before we are born, we have these little fingerprints, then I have to assume that God can read the character prints of a child before he is born. It's a disturbing thought. I'll come back to that a little bit later and some of the implications of that. It raises more questions than I can answer. So I'm not going to try to answer those questions right now. I want to turn to the consequences of that can be seen and described. I'm going to drag you back to our two twins, Jacob and Esau, particularly to Esau. Esau is also known in the Bible as Edom. If you want to read the prophecies about having to do with Esau and Edom, you've got to look up both words in your concordance and follow through on what happened to them in history and what God says is going to happen relative to them in the future. He and his descendants were granted the southernmost lands of Abraham's inheritance. It's the first land you come to when you leave Egypt. You come into the land of Amalek as you cross, well, that's actually beyond, just on this side of Suez where Abraham's inheritance begins. But the land really of Esau began once you cross what is now the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula. Not a particularly pleasant land down there, but that's what God gave to those people. In Genesis 36 is one of those boring genealogical passages most of us never read. We don't work our way through it. There is a character in this genealogy that we're going to encounter later in a very important context. He is a grandson of Esau. His name is Amalek, and not surprisingly, he is the father of the Amalekites. Exodus 17 describes an early encounter with Amalek. It's very familiar to all of us. If you've ever attended church very long, you have heard more than one sermon dealing with this particular set of events. But there's an aspect of this that I don't recall ever really hearing anyone develop, at least in the context of this particular passage. In Exodus chapter 17 and verse 8, they have crossed over into Sinai. They have now come to the property of the land of Amalek, which all they wanted to do was pass through it or buy it or get around it and get on up to the land that was going to be theirs. But then came Amalek, verse 8, and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him. He fought with Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand with the rod in it, that Israel prevailed. When he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. Now, I've heard preacher after preacher down through the years use this illustration, usually saying, you people have got to hold up my hands. I can't do anything by myself. And also, of course, it's been used to illustrate the fact that God is establishing the authority of Moses. That if Moses is holding up his hand, you win. He lets down his hand, you lose. So you've got to look to Moses as your leader. I've heard many variants on this theme. But Moses' hands were heavy. They took a stone, put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur stood by his hands, one on one side, the other on the other side. And they held up his hands, and they were steady till the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Okay, we won the day against Amalek. And the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in a book. Rehearse it in the ears, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Think about that. I said, God, speaking to Moses, write it down. I want it in a book. I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Unfortunately, we're still remembering them today, so I guess in a way we haven't managed that yet. Moses built an altar. He called the name of it Jehovah Nissi, for he said, because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Is that a disturbing concept? Now here's a people that God declares war on. After they declared war on him, of course. Israel was coming out of Egypt. They were God's people. They made no threat to the people of Amalek. They didn't want their land. They didn't want their inheritance. They just wanted to go by them and get up to the promised land. And Amalek decided they were going to fight. Amalek declared war on Israel. Israel had to fight, and God then declared war from generation to generation to generation upon Amalek, and he would not forget it. Why? Why was this so? Israel fought with other nations and won battles without a permanent, ongoing condemnation of the people through generations. They fought and won battles against people who were then allowed to live in peace with Israel at some time in the future. Why, in this particular case, was this response given? Well, it seems that Amalek was a singularly vicious and brutal enemy. And you don't usually hear this when you hear preachers go through the part about holding up Moses' hands. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And it's extremely significant in relation to what is happening here and why God declares war on Amalek from generation to generation to generation. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to you by the way when you were come forth out of Egypt. Now we're going to get a detail about this battle that was not given to us in the other location we read. How he met you by the way and smote the hindmost of you, even all that were feeble behind you, when you were faint and weary, and he didn't fear God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord has given you rest from all your enemies round about in the land where God has given you for an inheritance to possess it, you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget it. It means not to forget the fact that you are to blot out the remembrance of Amalek. Now, this reminded me of a scene from Henry V, where the French cavalry skirted the front lines of England's archers and pikemen and their cavalry, their armored divisions, went around behind them and killed the boys that were guarding the baggage in the rear. The unarmored, vulnerable little boys. If you've never seen Shakespeare's Henry V, Kenneth Branagh's movie on that, that can be rented somewhere, is really a superb piece of work. But the French went around, killed off all the boys behind, in spite of the fact that they had lost the day. Maybe that's the reason why they did it, is because they had lost the day on the battlefield. It was a cowardly act carried out in a rage of defeat, and it spoke to the character of those who did the act. And so Israel was told not to ever forget what Amalek did, because what Amalek did, perhaps in the rage of defeat, they attacked the rear of Israel's column, where the women, the children, the elderly, the sick, and the infirm were. And they killed those people. And God said, don't you ever forget it. Blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Does this make you uncomfortable? Perhaps it does. Get used to it. God is not someone you really get that comfortable with. You don't come into the presence of an all-consuming fire and sit down and get comfortable. Now we must fast forward to the time of Israel's first king, Saul, a giant of a man, head and shoulders above everyone else, and yet a man who in the beginning of his time was little in his own eyes. I want us to consider a familiar story, but with a broader understanding of what is at stake here. It's been, again, spoken of many times in many sermons about the failure of Saul and the reason why God rejected Saul and all the things that I've heard down through the years of that. But let's look at it again with a different perspective. 1 Samuel 15 is where we're going with this. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel." We got that done. Now, listen to the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way. He ambushed Israel. in the way as they came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Spare them not. Slay both man, woman, infant, suckling, ox, sheep, camel, and ass. Can you get used to that? Can you accept that? That was the instruction of God given to Saul. How would you feel given that instruction? Would you carry it out? Would you do what God instructed you to do? Now, why would he do this? Well, God is a God of justice. If you will remember, he took the firstborn only out of Egypt. When the Egyptian Pharaoh had killed every male child of the Israelites over a long period of time, throwing them in the Nile. So God gave them blood to drink, and God took their firstborn children. It is called justice. This gives you a hint of what the Amalekites did to the rear of the Israelite column on that day when they lay in ambush for them. They killed man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And God says, this is what you are going to do to Amalek. As Paul said on another occasion, behold, both the goodness and the severity of God. This is scorched earth policy. You take no bounty, no booty. You leave nothing alive behind you. Not even Sherman going through Georgia did that. Verse 4. Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen, 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And he said to the Kenites, who were other children of Edom, he said to the Kenites, get away from the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. This is a warning. Get out of here. So we have a line of refugees of Kenites fleeing to get away from Amalek. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah till you come to Shur that's over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. And of course, you have to think about something in this regard. In those days, kings fought. Kings fought at the head of their armies. This is one of the reasons why Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a man of war, a man to be reckoned with, a strong man, a fighter. Agag had been a fighter as well. Where did he find him? In a spider hole in the ground, perhaps? Fleeing, hiding away in his palace somewhere instead of out there with a sword in his hand to die with his people? Saul spared him. Saul and the people spared Agag, the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and everything that was good, and just refused to utterly destroy them. Everything that was vile and refuse, well, they destroyed that. Then came the word of the Lord to Samuel, saying, it repents me that I have set up Saul to be king. I'm sorry I did it, because he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried to the Lord all night. Verse 13. Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And you know, I think probably at that moment of time, Saul thought he had. That he had gotten 98% of what God sent him to do done. And so he said, I performed the commandment of the Lord. And I can't help but wonder sometimes about us. You know, when we assume that we have kept all the commandment of God, and well, I'm doing just fine. I did what God said I'm supposed to do. Samuel then said, well, if you've kept the commandment of the Lord, how come I hear this bleating of sheep and lowing of oxen? What's all that about? Well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people, pointing the finger, spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and we destroyed the rest of them. And I can see Samuel rolling his eyes to heaven and saying, oh, yeah, of course you did. This was one of those things of the adjustment of the motive on the spur of the moment. They had not kept those alive to sacrifice to God. They'd kept them alive to take them home. And now Saul said, I'd better figure out a better reason than that. Then Samuel said to Saul, stay and I'll tell you what the Lord said to me this night. He said, say on. And Samuel said, when you were little in your own eyes, weren't you made king over the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a journey and said, Go utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why did you then not obey the voice of the Lord, but flew upon the spoil and did evil in the sight of the Lord? Now Saul wasn't completely stupid. He said, Yes, I have. One day he said, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone in the way the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. I got the king here. We can kill him now. But the people took of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the chief things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. And Samuel says, Has God a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as he does in obeying the voice of the Lord? You think you can make adjustments in what God tells you to do. You can make your own decisions involved in them, and you think that sacrifice is better than doing as you're told. It reminds me of the old motto I saw on somebody's wall once. When all else fails, do as you're told. To obey is better than sacrifice. To hearken is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. And he just nailed Saul's hide to the wall with those two things. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. It's over. And Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Moral to that story is, don't be afraid of the people. And don't obey their voice. Obey God. Now therefore I pray you, pardon my sin. Turn again with me that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said, I will not return with you because you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king. And as Samuel turned to go away, he laid hold upon Saul, grabbed the skirt of his mantle, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, The Lord has rent the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also, the strength of Israel will not lie, nor repent, for he is not a man, that he should repent. Then Saul said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, I pray you, before the elders of my people and before Israel. Turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel turned again after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then here comes the climax of this whole story. Samuel said, Bring here Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him delicately. And Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Hard stuff. Prophet of God. Did you catch the significance, though, of Samuel's condemnation? Agag was a murderer of innocent children. He said, As your sword has made women childless, your mother is going to be childless. He didn't just kill him. He cut him into pieces. What happened to the Amalekites, as I said earlier, was the same justice that fell to the Egyptians because of the things that they had done. And Saul didn't even get all the Amalekites besides Agag, because David had to fight them later. And for all we know, they're still part of the people afflicting Israel to this day. We have no way of knowing one way or the other. At least the spirit of Amalek is still at large in the land. There's a little verse in Jeremiah, just one verse. It's in Jeremiah 48 and verse 10. And I've always been fascinated by this so many times that I've come across it in studies and teaching and what have you. Jeremiah 48:10 says this, Cursed be he that does the work of the Lord negligently, and cursed be he that keeps back his sword from blood. Kind of shocking, isn't it? To think that God would actually curse a person who held back his sword from the shedding of blood when it was time to shed blood. Because there is a time to kill. And it's something that we often forget because it makes us uncomfortable. And yet when you read Ecclesiastes, he said there is a time to kill and a time to heal. Sometimes you have it to do. What's confusing to Christians is that they are told not to kill. They are told to forgive. They are told to leave the vengeance to God. But what many people do not seem to understand is that the admonitions and the Christian virtues are personal virtues. And what God says when He tells you do not avenge yourselves, He is meaning personal, private vengeance. He is not saying that vengeance is wrong. What He is saying is you leave vengeance to the people who are supposed to carry it out. Many people think, well, we leave it to God, who He carries it out. He'll strike him with lightning who was out in the field one of these days. No, probably not. God will execute His vengeance by the hand of a police officer who runs the guy down, whacks him across the back of the head with a club, puts handcuffs on him, takes him off to jail. That's where God's vengeance comes into play. Ours are personal. Governments have duties that are not personal. And they are, in fact, God's duties. And it's another thing we have a hard time getting straight. Paul makes it as plain as it can be made, I think, in Romans the 13th chapter. Romans 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Who was that at that time? Here's Paul writing a letter to the Romans, and he says the powers that be. Who are the powers that be? Rome, the Roman government, Caesar. That's the powers that be. And he says these powers are ordained or appointed of God. Whoso therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Will you not be afraid of the power? Now, I think that's an interesting statement. And as a generalization, it's true. Oh, sure, you can have a corrupt government official who can be a terror to good works. But for the most part, governments are not a terror to good works. Will you not be afraid of the power? Do what is good, and you will have praise of the same. For He is the minister of God to you for good. But if you do what's evil, be afraid, for He bears not the sword in vain. For He is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon all that does evil. And I can say that during the years of the Roman Empire, they executed a lot of vengeance on people who did evil. And they probably also executed vengeance on a lot of people who hadn't done anything either. But that's what happens in this world. Now, I've taken heat for what someone called supporting Bush's war. Question. Do you suppose Samuel took heat for supporting Saul's war? Because it wasn't Saul's war, It was God's. And, of course, no, it's not the same. But George Bush is not playing David to Bill Clinton's Saul, even though the parallel might be there and might be appealing to some of us. What does all this have to do with my introduction, which was about 9/11? What does it have to do with what I had to say there? It has to do with understanding the enemy and the challenges a government has to face in dealing with this enemy. The way the Internet is, you sometimes things come to you out of the blue. Sometimes you stumble onto things and you never know when that's going to happen because there's such this vast universe of information out there. But someone was kind enough to send to me, it was one of these emails that are forwarded. You know how people forward things along, you say FW, 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 it's been forwarded 5 times. I think this one was only forwarded once because I rarely look at anything that's been forwarded twice. A man named Haim Harari was speaking to the Navy League. He was a former president of the Weizmann Institute and a theoretical physicist. And he was talking on this night about his part of the world, which was Israel and the Middle East and all the things that were there. And he actually had almost nothing to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because he said it really is irrelevant to the large. It's only a little part of the much larger picture of world conflict that's going on. It's a really fascinating speech, and if anyone really would like to read it, you'll have to drop me an email because the only place I know I can give it to you is a link to read the entire speech online, and I can do that. But you'll have to send me an email to do so. He spoke of the 4 main pillars of the current world conflict, which he called World War III. I've heard others call it World War IV, and I'm not really quite sure why they do that. He said, and I quote, "The first element is the suicide murder." Suicide murders are not a new invention, but they have been made popular, if I may use this expression, only lately. Even after September 11th, it seems most of the Western world does not yet understand this weapon. It is a very potent psychological weapon. Its real direct impact is relatively minor. The total number of casualties from hundreds of suicide murders within Israel in the last 3 years is much smaller than those due to car accidents. Simple truth. Everyone should know that. September 11th was quantitatively much less lethal than many earthquakes. More people die from AIDS in one day in Africa than all the Russians who died at the hands of Chechnya-based Muslim suicide murderers since that conflict started. He said that before the recent school massacre, but I think it's probably still true. Saddam killed every month more people than all those who died from suicide murder since the coalition occupation of Iraq. He killed more every month, 12 months out of every year. But the real fear, he said, comes from the undisputed fact that no defense and no preventive measures can succeed against a determined suicide murderer. And you know, all of us have our women and children in the rear. We have all of our elderly and our infirm in a safe place. And the fact is that these people would rather kill them than men of war. This has not yet penetrated, he says, Western thinking. The U.S. and Europe are constantly improving their defense against the last suicide murder, but not the next one. We may arrange for the best airport security in the world. But if you want to murder by suicide, you don't have to board a plane to explode yourself and kill people. Who could stop a suicide murderer in the midst of the crowded line waiting to be checked by the airport metal detector? Actually, you could get more people there than you would on the airplane. I've been in one of those lines. How about the lines at the check-in counters at a busy travel period? Put a metal detector in front of every train station in Spain, and the terrorists will get the buses. Protect the buses, they'll explode in movie theaters, concert halls, supermarkets, shopping malls, schools, hospitals. Put guards in front of every concert hall, and there will always be a line of people to be checked by the guards, and this line will be the target, not to speak of killing the guards themselves. You want a witness to that? You don't need one if you've been watching the news, because they've been attacking the lines in Iraq. What's behind the suicide murders, he asks? And this is really important. Listen carefully. What is behind the suicide murders? Money, power, and cold-blooded murderous incitement. Nothing else. And he is dead right. It has nothing to do with true fanatic religious beliefs. And I dare say most people have no idea that this is true. Most people think it's the fanatic religious beliefs. Not so. Quote, no Muslim preacher has ever blown himself up. No son of an Arab politician or religious leader has ever blown himself up. No relative of anyone influential has done it. Wouldn't you expect some of the religious leaders to do it themselves or to talk their sons into doing it if this is an act of supreme religious fervor? Sure you would, if that's what it was all about. It's not. And frankly, I am surprised that so few people in the world seem to have this through their heads. It has nothing to do with that. Aren't interested, he asks, in the benefits of going to heaven? Instead, they send outcast women, naive children, retarded people, and young, incited hotheads. They promise them the delights, mostly sexual, of the next world, and pay their families handsomely after the supreme act is performed, and enough innocent people are dead. Suicide murders also have nothing to do with poverty and despair. The poorest region in the world by far is Africa, and it never happens there. In the end, that, basically puts that question to rest. A suicide murder is simply a horrible, vicious weapon of cruel, inhuman, cynical, well-funded terrorists with no regard to human life, including the life of their fellow countrymen, but with very high regard to their own affluent well-being and their hunger for power. I mean, you don't even have to know who this man is when you read his piece. In fact, he describes himself. He says, just think of me as the taxi driver you get in a foreign country when you're there. You ask him, tell me about what's going on down here. Because when you read through his entire speech, you begin to realize, I don't need any credentials to understand that what this man is saying is true. It's logical. It makes sense. It matches the facts that are on the ground. In fact, all these things he's describing are the works, figuratively speaking, of an Amalekite. Continue to quote, the second ingredient is words, more precisely, lies. Words can be lethal. They kill people. An incredible number of people in the Arab world believe that September 11th never happened. Well, hey, there are people who believe, in this country, who believe we never sent anybody to the moon. They believe all that stuff was fake. Or they believe that it was an American provocation, or even better, a Jewish plot. Some people actually believe the CIA did it themselves. It's a daily occurrence, he says, that the same people who finance, arm, and dispatch suicide murderers condemn the act in English in front of Western TV cameras talking to a world audience which even partly believes them. It's a daily routine to hear the same leader making opposite statements in Arabic to his people and in English to the rest of the world. Now, I've known about this for a long time, and I keep asking myself, why do people pay any attention to Yasser Arafat? He says one thing in English and something exact opposite in Arabic, and everybody in the Middle East knows it. Why on earth they have not long ago taken that old man out and hanged him is beyond me. He's a murderer. Incitement by Arab TV, accompanied by horror pictures of mutilated bodies, has become a powerful weapon of those who lie, distort, and want to destroy everything. Little children are raised on deep hatred and on admiration of so-called martyrs, and the Western world doesn't notice it because their own television sets are mostly tuned to soap operas and game shows. We're just not paying attention to what's going on. But, he says, words also work in other ways, more subtle. A demonstration in Berlin carrying banners supporting Saddam's regime and featuring 3-year-old babies dressed as suicide bombers is defined as the press and by political leaders as a peace demonstration. You may support or oppose the Iraq War, but to refer to fans of Saddam, Arafat, or bin Laden as peace activists is a bit too much. A woman walks into an Israeli restaurant in midday, eats, observes families with old people and children eating their lunch in the adjacent tables, and pays the bill. She then blows herself up, killing 20 people, including many children, with heads and arms rolling around in the restaurant. She is called a martyr by several Arab leaders and an activist by the European press. Folks, this is all a part of the big lie, and it is being told again and again. These words are much more dangerous than many people realize. They provide an emotional infrastructure for atrocities. It was Joseph Goebbels who said, if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. He is now being outperformed by his successors. One of the more dangerous things about this is that just before World War II, in the Western media, many Western politicians believe and repeat the lies. This is true, you know. Before World War II, the Western press, Western leaders, believed Goebbels' lies and repeated them. To the extent that Chamberlain walks off the airplane, waves a document in the air, and says, peace in our time. And we all know where that led. To use the lies of Al Jazeera in a political campaign is absolutely inexcusable. It is divisive, and it hurts this country, and it's dangerous. Some of the leaders of these various circles that he talks about in this article, in this speech, live very comfortably on their loot. You meet their children in the best private schools in Europe, not in the training camps of the suicide murderers. The jihad soldiers join packaged death tours to Israel and other hotspots, while some of their leaders ski in Switzerland. Mrs. Arafat, who lives in Paris with her daughter, receives tens of thousands of dollars per month from the allegedly bankrupt Palestinian Authority, while a typical local ringleader of the Al-Aqsa Brigade, reporting to Arafat, receives only a cash payment of a couple of $100s for performing murders at the retail level. This is the way it is out there, folks. What this man is telling us is not unique information. Everybody knows this who is watching, looking, and studying and researching what's going on. The press knows where Mrs. Arafat lives. The press knows that these Islamic leaders are skiing in Switzerland. I have sat in the Carlton Tower Hotel, in the rib room of the Carlton Tower Hotel, one of the better restaurants in London, and been the only non-Arab in the place. They're all over the place. They have money. They are rich. In fact, it was all men, though, wasn't it? I don't think there was another woman in the place. If she was, it was another English couple or an American couple that were there. But the place is just lousy with rich Arabs in those places. The fourth element of the current world conflict, he says, is the total breaking of all laws. And this is something that we are going to have to get our minds around as a people. Not just you and me, the whole country need to get our minds around this and understand what this is. He said the civilized world believes in democracy, the rule of law, including international law, human rights, free speech, free press, among other liberties. There are naive, old-fashioned habits, such as respecting religious rights and symbols, not using ambulances and hospitals for acts of war, avoiding the mutilation of dead bodies, and not using children as human shields or human bombs. Never in history, not even in the Nazi period, was there such total disregard as all of the above as we observe now. Nazi officers would have died before they sheltered behind women and children. It would have been totally contrary to their ethic. They never did anything like this. Do you raid a mosque which serves as a terrorist ammunition storage place? Do you actually bomb it? Do something with it? Do you return fire if you're attacked from a hospital? Do you storm a church taken over by terrorists who took the priests as hostages? Do you search every ambulance after a few suicide murderers use ambulances to reach their targets? Do you strip every woman because one pretended to be pregnant and carried a suicide bomb on her belly? Do you shoot back at someone trying to kill you standing deliberately behind a group of children? Do you raid terrorist headquarters hidden in a mental hospital? Do you shoot an arch murderer who deliberately moves from one location to another, always surrounded by children? Do you do these things? All of these happen daily in Iraq and in the Palestinian areas. What do? Well, he still said, you do not want to face the dilemma, but it cannot be avoided. The problem is that the civilized world is still having illusions about the rule of law in a totally lawless environment. If we know our history here in Texas, we should understand that. Remember they used to say there was no law west of the Brazos and no God west of the Pecos? Yeah, out there you're on your own. You had to do what you had to do. But the civilized world, living in a land, can't handle it. It is trying to play ice hockey by sending a ballerina ice skater into the rink, or to knock out a heavyweight boxer by a chess player. We have the press, this is me talking, we have the press and the opposition political party forcing us to tie the hands of our men and women in battle because they simply do not understand this simple idea. Continuing now to quote, the amazing thing is that all these crooks demand protection under international law and define all those who attack them as war criminals, and some in the Western media repeat the allegations, which may be one of the reasons that leads some people to brand people like Michael Moore as traitors. Now, what does all this have to do with my introduction, which was about 9/11? It has to do with understanding the enemy and the challenges that our government has in dealing with this enemy. There is such a thing as bad seed. Why this is so, I can't explain. Why didn't God design the human being so that no one would ever be born who seemed to be bad to the bone and bad from the day he took his first breath of air? I have no idea. It's like asking why God didn't design the world so that hurricanes could not happen, so tornadoes couldn't take place, so lightning wouldn't strike people. Why didn't God design the world this way or that way? Or why did he design man so that this could happen? One day, we can ask him. Till then, we'll just have to evacuate before the hurricanes get there and figure out a way to deal with the bad seed. Failing to admit the existence of bad seed It's like denying that a hurricane is about to descend on us. It isn't going to save our necks when the hurricane gets here. Now we know absolutely what God instructed Saul to do with the Amalekites. It's right there, black and white, page of the Bible, unmistakable. You won't find any translation that will differ in any significant way from what happens here. The government today has no Samuel to give us instructions from God. But of course, we don't want God to appear in public life in this country, so we're on our own, I guess. Oddly, we have a president in office who called the jihadists evildoers. And I'll bet he has read the story of Saul and the Amalekites. The years ahead are going to be difficult. Haim Harari was optimistic. He said international law has always been slow in catching up, and that sooner or later, it'll begin to revolve certain things, certain procedures and changes in law. I'm not as optimistic as he is. Yeah, things will change. But in the course of that change, more and more freedoms are going to be lost to all of us and to the world, and more people are going to die. What can you do about this? Well, you can pray about it, of course, and pray for the safety of your family. The reason I'm telling you this today is for your understanding, so that you will think about things that are uncomfortable to think about. So you will consider things you'd rather not consider. So you will come face to face with the God of the Bible, who is, I'm not sorry to say, who is somewhat different from what we would like for him to be all the time. Better we should change than he.